In Act 2, Scene 2 of William Shakespeare's famous play Romeo and Juliet, Juliet says, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet." It seems that Juliet has already tapped into this idea that we talk about in Chapter 5, language. In this chapter, we're going to discuss the importance of language, the characteristics of language, the structure of language, as well as challenges and barriers that at times make language difficult, as well as some strategies to improve our verbal communication overall. So when we start out thinking about what is language and why is it important, we need to start off with the definition. I found this definition in a few textbooks, and it says, the structured system of signs, sounds, gestures, or marks used to express an idea. What I like about this particular definition is that it covers pretty much every single basis I could think of. That covers the sound, the vocal aspect of language. It talks about gestures, so the movements that we have non-verbally, non-vocally. For example, those who use American Sign Language or French Sign Language. Again, that is a form of language that they use. It may be non-vocal, but it's still language. And marks, which can be included in our written communication. So grammar, that's a rule within the language system. Be aware that language affects and is affected by our thoughts. We're going to come back to this idea in just a little bit. So let's start off with this characteristic of language being arbitrary. That words are merely just symbols. It's human beings who really give words their meaning. So think, for example, about a car. If I say car, and we don't have the same English language code, then that may not have any meaning for you. Or that may have a completely different object connected to that same word. But if we share a code, then that word has meaning. Now, it's not that naturally out in nature, if I were to see a car, any and everyone, no matter what language they spoke, would still say car when they saw that particular object. Again, it's quite arbitrary. We made it up. Our words are really the connection from our thoughts to other people. That in some way we've encoded these ideas out of our head, and the best way we've encoded them is through our words, through our language. Also be aware that language can be quite ambiguous. Words have no actual meaning on their own. They only have meaning when we give it to them. So the dictionary is something, again, that human beings created. Now there's a denotation, the dictionary meaning of a word. That over time, a bunch of scholars have gotten together, analyzed different words and different phrases, and decided this will mean this. So if I look up DOG in the dictionary, they will say four-legged animal, part of the canine family, who goes roof roof, who's often a pet. But if I think about the connotation, the meaning that I personally give this word through my experience, I may think about different pets that my friends have had, that I've cared for, who've licked me maybe a little bit too much at times, trying to kiss me, but they've always been playful. This is a very stark contrast from my interpretation of this word when I was a kid, because they were all larger than me and quite scary. So that personal connection that you have to a word is the connotation. Also think about the fact that words are abstract. Language itself is quite intangible. I mentioned earlier that car, the actual word itself, is not just out there in nature for us to pick it up and say it. It's something we made up. And at times, we use abstract to determine things that are also abstract. Sometimes we use it to describe things that are concrete. Now, when something's concrete, we can touch it, we can taste it, we can smell it, we can hear it, we can see it. For example, an apple. If you can interpret it through one of your five senses, or maybe one or more of your five senses, it is a concrete object. But then there's also the abstract terms that we have. For example, freedom and love. We have the idea of them, and we can even have expressions of them. But we don't actually have a way to touch them, or taste them, or smell them, or see them, or hear them. Then there's the specific versus the vague. The direct, very detailed, versus the maybe more indirect, less detailed ways of describing something. So if someone says, I live in a house. That's pretty vague, right? There are probably other words that they can choose to help describe where they live. The more details would end up with a more descriptive idea of what their house must look like. Then there's also the negative. Whenever you use a certain word, keep in mind that you're also not choosing another word to describe it. That you create a void or a separation between what something is and what it is not. I had a friend give me directions to her house, and she said, oh, I just have a cute little white house at the end of the block. I said, okay, I'll find you. I could not find this house because there are a bunch of other little cute white houses around. I needed her to tell me what was different. She didn't really make much of a separation there. It was also pretty vague. But sometimes it's best to explain what you don't mean to help people truly understand what you mean. Then when we get into the nature and the structure of language, you probably see a lot of things that you learned in your literature course. Metaphoric language, repetition, alliteration, parallelism, antithesis, and narrative. All of these things can also help you when it comes to how you use language in everyday life. Using a metaphor may simplify the process to help someone get what you're actually meaning. So when someone says, I put my heart into it, they don't mean their literal heart. They're using a metaphorical heart in this case to say that they gave it their all. Be aware that not all metaphors are created equally and that people don't always understand metaphors. Some people may take you literally. There's also the idea of repetition, repeating something in some way so that it sinks in. You'll notice in the future when you give speeches, there's going to be some repetition in how you structure things and say things. That's really to help people get it and remember the different pieces. Alliteration, the practice of using the same vowel or consonant sound at the beginning of consecutive words. So think about those tongue twisters that you had to use as a kid. Those are alliteration. Parallelism, putting like words or phrases together, kind of highlight how they have things in common. Antithesis. I know it looks like antithesis, right? But it's antithesis. At this point, you're comparing two contrasting ideas to show how they don't have something in common. Again, you're still playing out with this parallel structure, this parallelism, but you're showing the contrasting ideas. And then there's even the narrative, some storytelling. All of these different things about structure of our language and how we communicate can help set you up to be a really great public speaker, or even just be a great speaker one-on-one. So that's part one of our conversation on language. We're going to come back and talk about, well, what makes language difficult? It's not always easy, right? Why is that? And we'll also talk about some different guidelines that we can use to be better, competent communicators when it comes to our verbal communication.